Today we'll be replacing the exhaust manifold on a Ram pickup. First step would be to remove the passenger side front tire. And then you're going to want to disconnect the ABS wheel speed sensor from that inner fender liner. And then next will be to remove that fender liner completely to gain access to the right side of the engine and that exhaust manifold. There's a series of bolts and push clips that need to be removed. And once that's out of the way, get a clear view of the manifold. Next, we'll want to remove the heat shield that goes over the top of that manifold. Some of those studs may already be missing or broken. They could be rather rusty. We need to get that shield out of the way. Now there'll be 2 bolts to remove to disconnect the exhaust pipe from the manifold. On that lower one, he needed to use a wrench because the lock tab on that had broken off. Okay, now we can go ahead and remove all the manifold bolts. There are 9 altogether. Some of these have studs on them, and some of them are just traditional bolts. These may be difficult to break loose, or they may also just break off as soon as you start trying to turn on them. These bolts can, they have a hard life here, getting heated up and cooled down over and over again. But once all those bolts are removed, you can pull the manifold out. And in this case, we did have a few broken bolts.
With this bolt being broken off flush to the block, or a little bit recessed, I want to be able to build it out a little bit with some welds. So I'm taking a washer so that I don't want to weld the head, I want to weld the bolt. And I want to keep my weld on the bolt. So the washer is more or less a guide so that my weld gets onto the bolt and not the head. But people trying to do this at home, they would probably try and drill it out and it'd probably be okay.
We're going to weld a nut and see how that goes?
Yeah, because it's typically easier if you have the equipment to do it that way. Otherwise, you would drill the center of it and then use an extractor and pull it out.
So in this case, the mechanic decided to use a welding method of building up that stud with some welding material, and then finally actually welding a nut onto the end of that. which then allows a normal socket and ratchet to be used to remove that broken stud. The welding method works quite well, and it actually, at the same time, it's heating that bolt up and cooling it, which helps to break it loose as well. But like mentioned previously, if the welder's not available, then your best next bet would be to drill it out. Okay, with all of those broken studs removed, we can now install the new gasket and manifold. It's important to keep track of where those studs were and where the bolts were when you're going to reassemble it. And you want to get all of these started by hand first to make sure everything lines up. Sometimes aftermarket exhaust manifolds may be slightly different hole sizing or just shape, and so you may have to kind of work with a little bit to get everything to line up. So once all the bolts have been started by hand, you can go ahead and tighten them down. And in the end, you want to tighten them to 18 foot-pounds. Then next, you'll want to reconnect the exhaust pipe to that manifold. It'll be 2 bolts, and you'll want to torque those to 23 foot-pounds. Now the new heat shield should go back on. Hopefully your manifold came with a new heat shield. The old ones can be reused if they're still in good enough shape. These are going to be lower torque. You don't want to break the studs off. Okay, now we can put the wheel liner back in. Get it into place initially, and then start each of these by hand. Make sure they're all lined up and threaded in. Then you can go ahead and tighten them all down. Reconnect that ABS speed sensor connector, and then reinstall the front wheel. You're going to want to tighten those lug nuts to 130 foot-pounds after you initially snug them. Go ahead and torque those once the vehicle's on the ground. And then you'll want to start up the truck and listen for any exhaust leaks.